child in 1790 and her last at age 48 in 1820. 2 years earlier, her second daughter, Harriet, gave birth to Frederick Augustus Bailey. The baby's great-great-grandfather, Bailey, or his forebearers, like many other Talbot County slaves, may have been imported into the British West Indies before being sold to Maryland tobacco planters. Nothing of Africa was left in the given names. Harriet, Henry, Susan, repeated in affirmation of a sense of family continuity, generation after generation. But Bailey may have had an African source. In the 19th century, on Sapelo Island, Georgia, where Baileys still reside, there was a Fulfulde-speaking slave from Timbo Futajalone in the Guinea Highlands, who could write Arabic and who was the father of 12 sons. His name was Belali Muhammad. Belali, spelled in various ways, is a common Muslim name. Indeed, Bilal was the name of a black slave who was a muezzin, a caller to prayer, much admired by the Prophet Muhammad. "Verily, as I was mounting the stairs of God, I heard your footsteps before me." Belali slides easily into the English Bailey, a common African-American surname along the Atlantic coast. The records of Talbot County list no white Baileys from which the slave Baileys might have taken their name, and an African origin on the order of Belali is conceivable. Bailey had been owned by Richard Skinner, a prosperous tobacco planter on the Miles River neck. Bailey's granddaughter, Betsy, was the most valuable asset that Skinner's granddaughter, Anne Catherine Skinner, brought to her marriage to Aaron Anthony. American slavery was often homemade, rather than cut from a standard pattern, and it is striking how many different forms of the slave experience Frederick Douglass, as Frederick Bailey came to call himself, touched in his relatively few years as a slave. Because Betsy was a slave, her children and their children were slaves. But she lived with Isaac, a free man with the same surname as hers. If they were related, it is not known how. Isaac worked as a sawyer, while Betsy lived according to her own rules. In her cabin, Frederick could scarcely have experienced the formalities of American chattel slavery. His education in its disciplines, both subtle and brutal, came later, beginning when he was brought as a child to Y House, the great self-sufficient plantation of Edward Lloyd. When, at 20, he escaped slavery, it was from a city in which slaves engaged in urban commerce, hiring themselves out as artisans or day laborers. Between the years on the plantation and those in the city, with their different and contradictory ways of life, he worked, more typically, as a field hand, alongside 2 or 3 other slaves, raising cash crops for struggling farmers. But that was all long after he had left his grandmother's cabin. His earliest memory was of swinging on a rung of the ladder to the loft. As he put his early sensations together into a narrative, he recalled, moving backwards in time, mimicking farm animals, splashing into the creek without having to take off any clothes, because all he had on was a shirt, and being fed cornmeal mush with an oyster shell for a spoon. Douglass made the events of his childhood, like almost all the experiences of his early life that he described in his 3 autobiographies, into parables of slavery, ostensibly telling how the slave child escaped many troubles which befall and vex his white brother, such as being chided for handling his little knife and fork improperly. He made it clear that the slave child was deprived of all implements of gentility. But in this instance, as in too few others, private and sensuous recollections break through the moral he sought to point. His days, when the weather was warm, he wrote, and we confidently believe him, were spent in the pure open air and in the bright sunshine, running wild. Betsy, his grandmother, was the central presence in his early life. He reported no memory of his mother from the period before he was 6 years old. Both the records, which he never saw, and his family's traditional history, as he understood it, leave no doubt that Harriet Bailey was his mother. But he had no recollection of seeing her during his years in Betsy's cabin.